Okay, now for Mike Lacona's wrap-up.
I'd again like to thank Veritas Forum here at UCLA for inviting me to take part in tonight's debate. I'd also like to thank Richard for an enjoyable exchange. Well, many of you came this evening hoping to see the Christian get his butt kicked, or you came hoping to see the skeptic get his butt kicked. Well, for the skeptics here this evening, you've had a noble and skilled representative of your view. How will you answer the question, did Jesus rise from the dead? The eminent New Testament historian N.T. Wright comments, what we are after is high probability, and this is to be attained by examining all the possibilities, all the suggestions, and asking how well they explain the phenomena. In light of this, let's look now at our two theories this evening. The Christian theory that Jesus was resurrected certainly explains all of the evidence very well and without strain. It easily explains Jesus' death by crucifixion. It easily explains the empty tomb. Even though Richard believes the empty tomb is a legend, we've seen that there's good evidence for it, and a majority of scholars, a large majority, are convinced by this evidence. It easily explains the subsequent events or beliefs of many, friend and foe alike, that the resurrected Jesus had appeared to them. It easily explains the spread of the church, despite the fact that its leader had been killed. Moreover, all natural explanations posited fail or are highly unlikely. I'd like to add that the evidence I provided is based on early testimony, eyewitness testimony, enemy testimony, embarrassing testimony, and multiple testimonies. Historians consider this type of evidence very strong. Now let's look at Richard's hallucination legend hypothesis. There's no direct evidence in support of it. It's not the simplest theory. It contains numerous historiographical and linguistic inaccuracies, as we observed in his comparison with Caesar's crossing the Rubicon and his treatment of 1 Corinthians 15. Nothing destroys an otherwise interesting argument like the facts. He has to strain the Greek in order to accommodate his theory by requiring a secondary definition against the majority of major lexicons. I mean, he pulled it up and he looked at Hebrews. Well, sure, I don't deny that that means allegisamatha, means exchange elsewhere. The question is, what did Paul mean by it? And we see by the rest of his writings, he didn't mean exchange, he meant transformation. So adopting a secondary definition is meaningless. Now, in order to obtain data, he has to strain the gospel text, such as interpreting Luke and John as promoting a vision Jesus immediately after they discussed an empty tomb. It's ad hoc. That is, it includes assumptions about the past that aren't supported by our present understanding of reality. Remember, he said about the hallucinations, he says, okay, well, they're not group hallucinations, but what probably happened here is they all hallucinated the same thing simultaneously. So they were all in the frame of mind to hallucinate, and then whereas only 8% have auditory and visual hallucinations simultaneously. Not only did just one of them have that, although it's only 8% of the cases, but they all had it simultaneously. I think that's quite straining at the text. He goes by Mark, and in his closing statement said a lot about Mark said this and legendary. Listen, I disagree with it, and he does endorse MacDonald's writings, book in his writings. You can check it out online. But it's a moot point anyway. The evidence that I quoted and cited for Jesus' resurrection predates Mark by decades. So even if I'm wrong and Mark contains legendary developments, it's irrelevant. The stuff I quoted is decades earlier. He says 2 Corinthians 5, 50-50 chance, so I can't base my belief in resurrection on it. I wasn't. He was. He quoted that in support of his view. So it's necessary for his position. He presented it. His view omits important considerations such as intentionality and philosophical arguments against Jesus' resurrection. He talked about the spacecraft as being equivalent. I don't think it's the same. There's no evidence for aliens, but there is scientific evidence for the existence of God. Folks, I don't have to do any of this kind of strain with the Orthodox view of Jesus' resurrection. As N.T. Wright would say, Richard is building castles in the air, so it shouldn't be surprising when many of us don't feel obligated to rent a room. Given the strong evidence we have, when we add that Jesus' resurrection is the only plausible explanation that can account for it, and the evidence occurs in a context charged with religious significance, we can have a high degree of confidence that this event occurred. I close with this thought. In Mel Gibson's recent movie, The Passion, the most touching scene for me was when Jesus stumbled with the cross, and his mother ran up to him and said, "I'm here." And he responded and said, "Woman, I am making all things new." and he picked up the cross, and at that point he looked straight forward with a look of great focus and started moving forward in pain. And it reminded me of Hebrews 12:2 that says, Jesus, for the joy set before him, endured the cross, despising its shame. And I think about that and I say, wow, it was his joy to restore our relationship and make it possible for us to have an intimate relationship with God, that he thought little of the shame. Blessed be his holy and wonderful name.
That's it. Good, thank you. Welcome back to the final part of our evening together, which will be conducted via questions and answers from our speakers. And I've been invited to ask the first questions and then to select among the questions that have been submitted. There are way more than can be answered tonight. And some of the questions address issues that are not on the agenda for tonight, even though they're very important with respect to the later effect of Christian belief in history, or the larger question of the relationship of science and religion. Perhaps I should address my first question to Mike Licona. And I'll put two or three things together and you can pick up the part of it that you want to deal with. First of all, I think it would be helpful if you would help us understand from your perspective what it is about the traditions that God raised Jesus from the dead that makes it any different from the raising of Lazarus or the son of the widow of Nain. And related to that, I suppose, could be the question, why is it important for Jesus to have been raised by the God of Israel? That is to say, who was this Jesus to those who encountered him in the flesh? That's probably enough. Go ahead.
Thanks. Those are good questions. Regarding the tradition that God raised Jesus compared to Jesus raising Lazarus and the widow's son, I'd say the main difference is the widow's son and Lazarus wouldn't be considered resurrection. The term anastasis, Greek term anastasis, is not used there. These would be what theologians would refer to as resuscitations. And you say, well, Mike, that's splitting hairs. They both came back to life, or all, Jesus, the Gospels say Jesus came back to life bodily, Lazarus bodily, the widow's son bodily. Come on, you're splitting hairs there. But this was the difference in the Jewish concept there between the two. And if we didn't make such distinctions, well, then we'd have to say, well, draw parallels and say, well, every time you have a claim for a ghost appearance today, then that would be resurrection as well. And so we have to draw these distinctions. Regarding why Jesus' resurrection is so important is because Jesus himself listed it as the truth test by which we could know he was who he claimed to be. We have different claims predicting his death and resurrection, and they come in, they're multiply attested, and they come in different ways. And so if Jesus did not rise from the dead, then that makes him a false prophet whom no rational person should follow. But if he did rise from the dead, then it seems he did so in confirmation of his personal and radical claims.
Yeah, where to go with this? And I don't mean this to be, first of all, polemical, but in the earliest Christian writings, a great deal of attention.
Excuse me, would I be able to add anything to this?
Yeah, if you want to, sure, jump in. Yeah.
Would it be possible for me to get up a slide?
If
Slide 67, please. Now, there's a problem here. Mike says that there's a difference between resuscitation and resurrection. Well, maybe in concept from what you see in Paul, but there's no verbal or linguistic difference. For example, Paul uses actually unusual words for resurrection. He uses words for rising up from sleep, anastasis and agero, which can mean just getting up in any sense. whereas there were better words to use. Palingenesis, back to life. That's used by Plutarch, Matthew, Philo, some Jewish apocrypha. Anabiosis, return to life. Plato, Plutarch, Diogenes Laertius, talking about the Persian doctrine of resurrection, and 2 Maccabees. There's no terminological distinction between resurrection and resuscitation. The same words are used in Lucian, Hebrews 11:35, Mark 5:42, 6:14-16, Matthew 9:25, Luke 8:55, 9:7-8, Acts 14:19-20. The resurrection of Jairus' daughter is aniste. It's using the exact same word. So in the Bible, there's no actual vocabulary difference between resuscitation and resurrection. But Mike is correct in the one sense that certainly Paul believed that after the resurrection you would be indestructible and glorious and made of a different substance. That's exactly my point. The body is different, and that's how Paul makes the distinction. But the distinction is conceptual. It's not verbal. And from the Jewish sources like the Talmud, they treat past resurrections as being the same. The resurrections in Ecclesiastes, for example, in the Talmud, are regarded as being resurrections. So I don't agree that there's this difference between resuscitation and resurrection terminologically. It's only conceptually, and it's only what we see from Paul and people like him, and that's the basis of my actual position.
I don't know if you allow for, can I respond to that?
Yeah.
Excellent.
I hope so.
Hey, as long as you're hot and cooking, I'll let you know if it doesn't work. Go ahead.
Well, certain of these words that he's quoting from secular writers here, like Plutarch or Plato and Plutarch, these are Gentile writers, or these are pagan writers. Okay, they're non-Jewish.
That's why I included Jewish sources up there.
Right.
I just meant to attest that the
Exactly,
Greek words,
but like
the Greek words existed in the Greek language. That
Right,
was
but the
my point.
Maccabean ones that you mentioned, anastasis is used there as well. And you look at Maccabees, 2 Maccabees 7 and 14, and what they're talking about there, the brothers who die and they get their tongue cut off, they get their arms chopped off, and they say, hey, we're going to receive these in the afterlife. God's going to give them back. It's definitely
I
referred
agree.
to bodily.
I agree. That is the rabbinical view, and that's what you find in the Talmud. But it's used with the same. But the fact that they use both words, whereas Paul never uses any of these other words for resurrection, I think that's peculiar, and I think it fits more the idea that Paul conceived of resurrection as a going up into a new body. That's all I'm saying.
Okay, one of the questions that came from the audience was just asking each of you very briefly to present your credentials for talking about the Greek language in the first century.
Okay. Well, I have a Master of Arts in New Testament history, but that really started off and almost completed as a degree in New Testament Greek, Koine Greek. And in fact, I have 10 courses, graduate courses in New Testament Greek and Koine Greek. And afterward, I didn't know whether I wanted to stay with Christianity. I just loved studying Greek, but I thought, wow, I didn't know if this stuff's really true. And that's when I began going through my intense questioning and so forth. I ended up finishing up in New Testament history because I did my thesis on the historicity of the resurrection. So it was more of apologetics, but all my classwork was specializing in Koine Greek. And I've studied it now for 21 years.
Okay, Richard.
Slide 71, please.
Hey, look out, this man has a slide for everything.
Those are my qualifications. 2 years ancient Greek studies at Berkeley. I've had a year of papyrology under one of the world's leading papyrologists, Roger Bagnall at Columbia. And most papyri, by the way, is written in Koine, very badly written in Koine. I've had 1 year Greek dialects and linguistics. This is the study of all the different dialects, Koine among the others, and comparing them morphologically, etymologically, and phonologically. And I've had Greek manuscripts and paleography under Leonardo Terran, who's another leading scholar at Columbia. And I've had 3 years specialized personal training at Columbia in Koine texts, the New Testament, Josephus, Plutarch, Lucian, Diogenes Laertius, Sextus Empiricus, and some church fathers are the ones that I've studied. That's it.
Okay. So in short, in order to get the answer to some of these questions, we need to be in a seminar for the whole quarter and discussing the text one by one and seeing exactly how words function. Because it has become a truism that individual words by themselves have relatively little meaning. That is to say, they have to be read in their context. The context is always, it's not just a sentence even, it has to be a paragraph or a longer passage in which we can see what people do. I want to come back to another question to Lacona in just a minute, but first of all, then, I think it's only fair for me to ask Carrier a hard question, too.
Yeah, please.
In light of your knowledge of the ancient world and your discussion of these documents, how would you go about accounting for the turnaround in the lives of the followers of Jesus that led to the creation of a community, first of all, in Jerusalem, that goes so much against the grain to reject social status as a basis for community, that turns its back on temple sacrifice and worship, begins to share goods with each other, making sure that no one was in need, giving honor to each other rather than following through on conventional male socialization, to seek honor for themselves and their families, the rejection of patriarchal obedience, and eventually following through on rejecting bloodlines as the basis for defining God's community. Now, that's a mouthful, but I was trying to put some flesh on the idea that we see here, a very powerful against-the-grain social revolution that's taking place that they say is sparked by their conviction that Jesus is alive.
That's a tough one to answer in a short period of time.
Yeah.
I'll stick to two Aristotelian categories here.
Okay.
The efficient cause of that situation would be the hallucinations, the religious visions, and this is very common in anthropological studies of ancient religion, where visions will appear to someone that will result in them coming up with an idea to transform and change their society in fundamental ways. The idea for, we have Joseph Smith, whether you believe he was a liar or really did see something. We have Muhammad, for example. There are a variety of these. There's a lot of the creation of Santeria, the Rastafarianism. A lot of these religions begin with visions or religious experiences, the feeling of the Holy Spirit and so forth, that lead them to transform their society, or to attempt to transform their society, and to change fundamental aspects, things that they think are broken in society, to change them. We have a lot of documented cases of this. And the efficient cause, what I would say, would be the hallucinations that taught them, or that gave them the convincing belief that what Jesus was saying, that Jesus' idea for transforming society was right, was endorsed by God, and would work, and that they should strive and fight to the death to make it happen because it was right and it was the good thing for Israel. That's the efficient cause. The final cause would be the reason why, whether this was consciously understood or subconsciously understood. I believe that there were two principal problems facing Judea at this time in the 30s AD. One was the complete corruption, or near complete corruption, of the temple cult, which was controlled by various Jewish factions that were essentially making money off of the organization, and we're not really looking after the interests of the moral reform of society, which is what the temple was supposed to be. So to change this, you needed to either gain military control of the temple, which was impossible. The Zealots attempted it, but the Romans were simply too powerful, and this was the other problem. You couldn't overcome the Romans. You could probably hope for a miracle from God, but otherwise, if that wasn't the case, the other way to do it would be to change it from the ground up. And I think the whole idea, the really clever idea that the Christians came up with, or at least maybe Jesus came up with, was the idea that if you get rid of the temple cult, you eliminate the control, the power, the ability to pull the strings of the Jewish elite, and you eliminate the role of the Roman question. You can transform society from the ground up. And if you look at the ideology in the New Testament, especially the epistles, Jesus completely replaces the temple cult. He serves every single function that the temple cult originally served, and he serves it by his dying and his resurrection. He is the new Passover lamb. He is the new resurrection. People who join him become the new Israel. And this is their way to sort of subvert society and sort of get things right back the way they wanted. And a lot of the things that they wanted to change were exactly the things that poor people wanted to change. They didn't like the idea of status giving people different powers and positions. They wanted equality. They didn't want wealth to be a factor to lord it over to other people. They wanted sort of a communal situation where everybody would be treated equally. Nobody would be wealthier than anybody else. This was their idea of justice, and there were a lot of groups in the ancient world that wanted this. And it makes a lot of sense. And so that was the original motivation for Christianity, was to get this new moral transformation of society. And there were two ways to do it. One was to take over the temple by force. The other was to transform it from the bottom up by replacing the temple cult with a new thing, something that the elites could not control. And the elites could not control a spiritual Christ.
Could I respond to that?
Absolutely, sure.
Yep.
Keep it going.
As far as that what his explanation, I mean, it's certainly an explanation, but I don't think it's the best one by any means. Back then, there were a lot of alleged messiahs, and as Bill Craig points out, there were many messiahs that came along and they got killed. And when they got killed, when your messiah died, you either found another messiah or you went home. And so what happens here we have with the Christians is their Messiah is now dead, and according to the rabbinic interpretation of Deuteronomy 21:23, cursed is any man who is hung on a tree or a cross here. They, as Jews, would have had to look at Jesus and say, he was cursed by God. This couldn't have been the same Messiah that we were looking for. And so the explosion of Christianity afterwards is just phenomenal, and it's very difficult to explain without appearances and without an empty tomb. Now, he mentions about the appearance. He says you got the Rastafarians, Mormonism, Islam, they're all based on visions. But these aren't good parallels. They're poorly evidenced, they're poorly attested, and there's no enemy attestation. Regarding hallucinations, as I pointed out before, they don't account for the empty tomb, they don't account for the conversion of the church persecutor Paul, and they don't account for the conversion of the skeptic James.
Well, of course, there is no enemy attestation of the empty tomb. It's not in any document that is not written by a Christian, first of all. And secondly, the reason Jesus had to be cursed by God is that he had to be the sacrificial lamb. He had to carry away the sins of Israel, so he had to be treated as a sinner. But you notice it's fundamentals of the Christian doctrine was that he was punished unjustly, that he was not truly a sinner. But nevertheless, by submitting himself to the justice system, by actually undergoing the punishment that a sinner would undergo, even though he wasn't a sinner, allowed him to take our sins away with him. And this was the whole idea behind it. Now, the reason the other messiahs didn't get this thing started is because they didn't think of it. I think Jesus is the one who preached this idea that, look, if we replace the temple cult, we solve all these problems. Now, if you look at the other messiahs that Josephus reports, they all tried to lead military movements to regain control of the temple. I think that's exactly what the Christians did not do. They tried to change things from the ground up, and the way to do that was to replace the temple cult, and they did it by replacing it with a spiritual Jesus. And it's possible that Jesus came up with this idea, but even if he didn't, it's very possible that his followers came up with it, possibly through inspiration, because it's very clever.
Well, that's pretty interesting. Unfortunately, there's no evidence for it. And
well, I
when you
think
say
there
that
is.
there's no enemy attestation by a non-Christian source, just because we don't have a document doesn't mean that we can't believe what we read in a couple of sources. I mean, you in your writings quote Plato on one book and say, yeah, we don't have this work, but Eusebius quotes him, and Eusebius is a Christian source. So we do have Matthew reporting that says the Jewish leadership said the disciples stole the body, and they were still saying it to his day.
But why doesn't Acts list this accusation? Why does no other Christian document in the first century mention this accusation? Why does no Jewish document include this accusation? Why is it not in any actual enemy source? And when we do find polemic, Jewish polemic in the Talmud, for example, or in any source, it never mentions this. It always mentions other attacks on Christianity, like, for instance, attacks against the trial.
Right, but unfortunately, the Talmud is hundreds of years later, and just
Yes,
about every scholar admits that the
point-
Talmud has very
Please,
little
one at a
historical authenticity to it.
The point, though, I'm making is that you can't claim that there's enemy attestation when there isn't. I mean, you're saying that a
Except for
Christian
Tertullian
claimed,
and Justin, who reports that
who get the
Jewish
idea
leadership.
from Matthew. I mean, they're getting the thing from Matthew.
No, they said they were still
But
going on in
gentlemen,
their
I mean,
own day.
It seems to me that, that if we had a non-believer who believed that God raised Jesus from the dead, he wouldn't be a non-believer anymore. I mean, we see we're going in circles here.
I don't understand what you're saying.
If we're looking for a non-believing testimony to...
No. We're talking about a non-believer who's accusing them of stealing the body. So we're talking about
I see.
unbelievers. We're not talking about believers. We don't have any actual first century document or any Jewish source, in fact, that accuses the Christians of stealing the body. Even Acts does not mention this accusation, even though Acts records a lot of the Jewish attacks on the church.
Point. You're right. Okay, one more then for Mike, and then another one for Richard, and then I've been interspersing these other questions as well. So some of the questions from the floor are already being answered. One passage that has always fascinated me is in Matthew 28, where it says, "Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them, and when they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted." That's something that Matthew could have skated over real easy. 3 words that a lot of people would have been glad if he were left out of the narrative. What do you do with that?
Okay, that's a very good question, and I have wrestled with that. For well over a century, Greek exegetes have recognized that the Greek there, hoi de, can refer to 2 different groups. Now, of course, that could be some of the disciples who worshiped him and the others who doubted, but it could also mean the disciples as one group and others who weren't the disciples who were the ones who doubted. The Greek word is distazo, and it's used one other time in the New Testament. In fact, that's in Matthew, the same author, that appears just a couple chapters before with Peter walking on the water. Peter's out on the water, he sees the waves, he begins to doubt, and then he begins to sink. But notice that he doubts while he's having faith, while he's out there. So the Greek word distazo means two, to think two things simultaneously. Now, there's one other explanation that I find even more convincing, and this is that this appearance takes place in Galilee, which is a 3 days walk from Jerusalem. And so what you have, perhaps, is the disciples meet Jesus in Galilee, see him for the first time. Then they go into Galilee and they meet Jesus there, and he appears to them. And those who doubted were others who were in Galilee. This is Jesus' hometown. And so they see Jesus there, and one guy says, man, isn't this remarkable seeing Jesus? Can't you hear this discussion go on? And the non-believer says, well, what do you mean? I mean, we've seen him here before. But you don't get it. He was crucified just a week ago in Jerusalem. Yeah, right. I see him right here. Yeah, but he's risen from the dead. So the thing is, they may have doubted the resurrection because they doubted his death to begin with, not because they looked and saw this ethereal type of visionary experience at this point. And so that's how I would explain that.
You want to comment on that, Richard?
Yeah, I don't think Matthew was writing history. I think that he's comparing Jesus to Moses on Mount Sinai. Jesus is the new Moses on the new Sinai. That's why he's on a mountain. Some who doubted is an allusion to those who went to the golden calf in the famous story of the Ten Commandments. The some who doubted are the ones who are going to die because they don't believe. And we know Matthew compared Jesus to Moses. He has the whole flight to Egypt scenario. The Herod tried to kill him, very similar to the way Moses was tried to be killed. So I think Matthew is sort of painting a story where Jesus is the new Moses. So I don't think there's any sort of historical support here for either of our positions in Matthew's account. I follow Dr. Talbert, who argues that the genre of the Gospels is myth, certainly of Matthew and Mark. I don't think that they even thought they were writing history. Luke is a different story, but Mark and Matthew, I'm pretty sure, were writing myth.
Well, as you know, C.S. Lewis taught at Oxford. He had studied, and he said he studied myth, legend, and romance all of his life. And he says when a person says that the Gospels are myth, he distrusts them as critics because he has studied and read myth and legend all his life. And he says, I can tell you, not one of these reads like the Gospels.
Well, I would say don't read a 50-year-old author, read a modern author. Dr. Talbert's book, What is a Gospel, is extremely well-researched, extremely well-documented, and his argument is very good. I highly recommend the book. It goes into great detail showing how the whole genre, the structure, the nature, the themes, the form of the narrative, the kind of language that's in the Gospels fits that of myth much better than it fits that of history. The one exception I would personally make is Luke, where I think Luke is consciously mimicking the genre of history. And if you read Luke and compare it to, say, Mark, you really see the difference. But if you want to see the differences lined out one by one, read Talbert's book. Talbert also wrote a book on the genre of Luke. I can't recall the title of it right now, but I'm sure if once you find What is a Gospel, you will be able to find the author and then find his other works.
Well, regarding Talbert, you said similar things about Dennis MacDonald's book in your online writings, and we saw that was full of holes too.
Well,
Wait a minute.
I should point out.
Please.
I should point out that Dennis MacDonald. I believe Dennis MacDonald is right on some things. I do not say on my website, and I've never advocated that he's right about his interpretation of the resurrection doctrine, particularly the empty tomb. I don't think he has a prescient view. So in fact, I would actually agree with some of your criticisms of MacDonald on that point. That does not discredit MacDonald's finding of parallels, for example, in the feasts and so forth. There are other issues that MacDonald, I think, does get right. I don't think we can reject him completely just because he gets a few things a little iffy. Talbert, by the way, makes a much better case than MacDonald. I would read Talbert first.
Okay, a new question for Carrier. Since no claims were made, so far as we know, for the resurrection of the great Jewish teachers Hillel and Shammai, why do you think that such a claim was made about Jesus of Nazareth?
Why he was resurrected and not them?
Yeah, why? I mean, why?
Well, that's like
why?
I said before. I mean, no one else thought of it. It's the same reason, why didn't anyone else think that the Rastafari, king of Ethiopia, was the second coming of Christ, except the Rastafarians? you know, they're the ones who thought of it. The same thing, Joseph Smith. I mean, no one else came up with Mormonism. That was his thing. It didn't get duplicated. The Heaven's Gate cult. No one else thought that there was a spaceship coming to get them flying behind Comet Hale-Bopp. That was their idea. I think the same thing goes for Christianity. The Christians came up with the idea first. And I think, for example, Hillel and so forth belonged to a completely different sect of Judaism that would have been much more hostile to the idea in much the same way that Paul was. And that's why I think it's so rare to find someone from that sect converting and joining Christianity like Paul, and he's the only example of a persecutor.
Are you
of
talking
Christianity
about the
we know.
sect of the Pharisees, sir?
I'm sorry, what?
Are you talking about the sect of the Pharisees, in which Hillel and Shammai were big leaders, and in which Paul of Tarsus
Yes,
was
well,
a member? Yeah.
of the rabbinical texts, whichever sect you want to plug them in, they don't share a lot of the similar doctrines of the Essenes, for example.
This is true. You want to say anything about that? Or
Yes,
we're gonna go on?
as
Okay.
far as no one else thought of it. Well, most scholars believe that the disciples and those claiming that Jesus' resurrection, they wouldn't have said resurrection in their day. They may have said Jesus had been exalted into heaven, but they wouldn't have claimed resurrection because the Jewish thought was that the resurrection was going to happen on the last day. And so it appears that the disciples, when they saw Jesus resurrected, that this was quite confusing to them. And as N.T. Wright argues in The Resurrection of Son of God, he argues for an early dating of the Gospels, not the Gospels, I'm sorry, but the resurrection narratives in the Gospels. He says they even probably predate Paul because they are just not theologically adorned, because when you look at crucifixion and stuff like that, they all had reasons to account for the crucifixion. They were able to relate it back to prophecies and or accounts in Psalm 22 and in Isaiah, his description of a crucified victim that way. But you don't find that with the resurrection. They're not even quoting the scriptures there because they're still trying to piece this together. How can this happen in our day? And you would think that if they were making this up, if this was this new idea that they came up with, they would have been finding scriptures to do that. But we find that happens later on in Acts, but we don't find it in the resurrection narratives in the Gospels.
Well, the resurrection narratives in the Gospels, well, for example, Mark, he does borrow a lot of phrases and concepts that are clear markers back to other things, as I pointed out. He's getting the idea from ancient texts. For example, the fact that he starts the narrative with the phrase, on the first day of the week, using a very unusual form of the thing. It's like on the first from the Sabbaths, which is a very strange way to put it. It's identical, word for word, from Psalm, I believe, 24 in the Septuagint. So it's very strange that even though Paul is saying that it's on the third day of the week, Mark changes it to the first day, using the exact same phrase, on the first from the Sabbaths. So clearly Mark is creating this parallel with Psalm 24, as I pointed out earlier. So this is the kind of theological adornment we find. I mean, it's the idea that we're taking these symbols that have cultural meaning at the time and putting them all together to convey something. I would say it's more like a parable than anything. But it draws on one's knowledge of the scriptures, and that's the kind of theological adornment I'm talking about. Whether the Gospels existed in Paul's day, I mean, Paul never refers to them. He never refers to the stories in them. So we really can't make any claims based on any actual evidence that the Gospels or the stories existed before Mark, for example.
Well, as far as Paul being unaware of the stories in the Gospels, you got to look at Paul's reason for writing. He's not trying to write a biography for Jesus. Apparently, he may have thought that this had already been done, and he didn't need to do it. Besides, he wasn't there during Jesus' ministry, and so he's not qualified in a position, as the disciples would have been, to do that. He's writing concerning issues in the churches, and so, but he may be aware of them. At least in 1 Timothy, I think it is, or 2 Timothy. And even if this isn't Pauline, I think it probably is, but even if it isn't, it's still Pauline thought behind it. And he even quotes Luke there. So I think that he is aware of it. On the third day of the week he doesn't say on the third day of the week, he says on the third day.
I'm sorry, you're right. Yeah,
Okay.
That was my mistake.
Okay.
And that appears to be the earliest.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up one of the questions from the floor now and to pursue. It turns out that this is a question that tags right on to the end of Richard's last wrap-up. And this is addressed to you, Mike. Why, in God's design, is Jesus' resurrection relatively so private and Jesus' crucifixion so relatively public?
That's a great question. I don't know.
All right.
I don't know. I do know that Jesus' crucifixion was public, for certain. His resurrection occurred to both disciples, but you also have an enemy of Christianity, one who hated Jesus, Paul. And he reports that he experienced a post-mortem appearance of Jesus, and so did the skeptic James as well.
But Paul doesn't report touching wounds or seeing Jesus eat, or Jesus saying that he wasn't a spirit, or flying up into heaven, or any of those things. All of the evidence that the appearance was of a flesh and blood body are not in Paul. Paul's talking about a vision. Even Acts depicts it as a vision. Now, I'd like to bring up slide 22 to sort of bring emphasis to this question that was asked. I mean, let's put the question this way. According to Lacona's theory, the God of the universe, the whole universe, who loves us all and came to preach a message of salvation to all mankind, appeared in his resurrection body in only one tiny place in the whole of the civilized world, at only one time in all of human history, to only a small number of people, almost none of whom were hostile or neutral observers, and all of whom were superstitious people lacking in scientific understanding. Now, I think this is very improbable unless you see it as not the God of the universe, but as natural hallucinations of them believing that they were seeing the God of the universe. The actual God of the universe would have done things radically differently, at least I would expect.
Okay, well, you mentioned about Acts, or that Paul said it was a vision. You didn't establish that. In fact, I showed that was wrong. He said bodily resurrection. Moreover, Acts, you said, depicts this appearance to Paul as a vision. No, this is a post-ascension appearance, and that does make a difference right there, because the disciples said that they saw Jesus right after he had risen from the dead, prior to his ascension. Paul says he saw Jesus from heaven. Plus, in the three records, you have, says that Paul saw the others, his traveling companions, saw the light and heard the voice. They just didn't understand the voice. So this couldn't have been a vision, because the others participated as well, and it's just like dreams in that way. You couldn't wake up your wife in the middle of the night and say, honey, I'm having this dream, we're in Hawaii. Join me in my dream and we'll have this free vacation. Visions are private occurrences. You said, well, they're all superstitious. Well, that's a classic ad hominem argument. And by that, you could say that even if they did have it, you say, well, these guys are superstitious, so there'd be no way of showing that they really did have a legitimate, genuine encounter with the risen Jesus. And the same thing today. I mean, if I said I saw Jesus today, you'd say, well, you're just superstitious.
Well, that's not what I'm arguing. I'm just saying that for God to choose people who were particularly superstitious relative to today. I mean, if God appeared today, if God appeared right here, right now, I mean, I wouldn't regard myself as superstitious. I mean, that would be much better evidence. But if
you would just say we're all having a collective hallucination.
Not necessarily. I wouldn't necessarily say that. It would depend on the situation. I do believe it's possible to prove things like that a vision is a real vision of a real God. It depends on the nature and scale of the evidence. I don't think we have that kind of evidence in this particular case. That's all I'm saying. Now, what I would like to respond is the post-ascension argument. Paul never says his appearance was post-ascension. In fact, Paul never says any appearances were before the ascension. Paul never makes any distinction between resurrection or ascension. In all of his creeds, he says that Christ died and then was ascended to heaven. He doesn't have a resurrection and then appearances and then ascension. The idea that Paul's vision was only post-ascension appears only in Luke, which, of course, is the guy who's arguing that the body, that Christ rose in the flesh. So he has to have.
Yeah, but it's the same one where Paul is giving the testimony, because Paul doesn't give a specific one in his writings.
That does bring up slide 72, please.
You got to get some slides.
Well, like I said, Paul never says anything to even suggest it. He equates his visions with others. His creeds, let's see. Well, okay, that's what I just argued, actually. I have another one.
That's fine.
Slide 72, please. No, I'm sorry. 43, thank you. Now, the account in Acts is not something that I find very reliable. I was just talking with someone in the break why I didn't use more evidence in Acts, for example, that Paul's vision was a form of epilepsy. One can argue that, for example, in Acts, Paul sees a bright light, he's knocked down, he's temporarily blinded, he hears voices. These are symptoms of various things like temporal lobe epilepsy. One could argue this. I chose not to because I don't trust Acts, actually. Acts was written by a Sarcissists, and one who I don't trust is very reliable. And one point
But you quoted him to support your view. The very text that you don't think
Luke?
is reliable.
You talking about Luke or Acts?
Acts.
What are you
Quoted
talking about?
Paul's conversion experience.
Well, no, and I think there's a reason why Acts actually includes Paul's vision in that weird way, unlike all the other appearances in Luke, because I think Luke was facing an actual tradition history for Paul when he gets to that, and that's why he has to make the vision different. Now, if we compare Paul's account in Galatians versus Acts, he doesn't mention there being any attendance. He denies meeting anyone, much less Ananias. He places his return to Jerusalem with Barnabas years later, and there's no suggestion of danger. So Paul's account of his vision and the account in Acts are very different, and that's why I don't trust Acts' account entirely. I think that if there's any evidence in Acts regarding Paul's vision, it's that it was a vision and not a contact with flesh and blood Christ.
Well, the thing that came later, though, that's 17 years after he allegedly had his experience. And when you appeal to Acts to say that Paul had this vision, which you could interpret as a hallucination, or that Paul didn't think of it this way because he thought of it as a vision, you just go to Acts 13, and Paul very clearly says there that it's bodily resurrection. He contrasts risen Jesus with King David. He said, David died, was buried, his body decayed. Jesus, on the other hand, died and was buried, but his body did not decay. Rather, God raised it up, and if that were all eyewitnesses, he couldn't have been more clear about bodily resurrection. And finally, about the epilepsy, the temporal lobe epilepsy, I asked a doctor about this some time ago, and he said he had worked extensively with epilepsy patients, and he said when you have epilepsy, you don't remember your seizures. There is no thought about a bright light or hearing a voice or anything. You don't remember anything about the experience at all, so I don't know where you're getting this from.
Well, I was referring to someone else's theory, not one that I actually defended, because I don't actually trust Acts as a source. Would you bring slide 52, please?
Well, wait a minute, though. You made this claim about epilepsy, and then you say, well, I don't know that you say you don't know that you believe it after all. Why bring it up?
No, I mentioned it because I was talking about someone else who said, why didn't I make that argument? That's what I was talking about. I said, someone had asked me in the break why I didn't make that argument, and I was explaining that I didn't because I don't trust Acts.
Okay.
Now, if you have that, I'd like to bring up this other point. You mentioned a particular passage in Acts. If you look at Acts 16:10, if we don't need to go into this, but if you look at the slide, what happens in Acts is Luke takes a passage in Psalms that doesn't really say what Luke then interprets it to say, and he interprets it in a completely different way, and he puts these words in the mouth of Peter, arguing that the resurrection was a resurrection of the flesh. I mean, this is the kind of thing that Luke is doing. He's distorting the record to argue for his particular position. And this is the reason why I don't really trust Acts as a source.
Yeah, okay. I can assure the people here of two things. One is that I do plan to shut down the open meeting at 5 after 10, which will be in about 12 minutes, so you can count on that, which doesn't mean that the speakers are going to vanish, but it'll be on a private basis. The second thing is I can assure you, too, that many of the questions that you've asked have been answered as these people have been dialoguing with each other, and I have to congratulate them with the civil way in which they are discussing very important issues. This is one of the best debates I've ever been present at. I congratulate you guys. All right, this is a question for Carrier, especially appropriate in light of the fact that on both sides, N.T. Wright's book, most recent book, has been referenced. The question goes like this. N.T. Wright argues that the Jews believed in a physical resurrection because it would be a reaffirmation of the physical world as good. This theme is echoed throughout the New Testament of the world being restored. Heaven, therefore, is not a physical place, but the place from which God's plans and future comes from. How then do you explain an idea of spiritual resurrection as a reaffirmation of creation, as it is clearly argued and affirmed in the New Testament?
Well, Paul doesn't actually defend that view himself. His view appears to be very similar to a very common view in the ancient world, that everything below the lunar orb, everything below the moon was doomed to corruption and it was subject to decay, whereas everything above the orb of the moon was perfect and indestructible and eternal, using the same kind of language that Paul uses about the two bodies. I think there's views like Paul's which hold that, and for example, we see this clearly in Philo, where the idea is that everything on earth is bad, but it's going to be replaced with something so much better, and that's what Paul's arguing. It's not a reaffirmation of the old creation, although to Paul the creation served the purpose of God and working his way towards the new creation when he's going to remake the world and make it a hell of a lot better and give us very much better bodies.
A question that was addressed to both of you that you've touched on, but perhaps have not answered definitively. As you understand it, is it possible for a group of people to have similar hallucinations? And related to that, then, was a question that runs like this. I don't have it right before me, but the content is in my head. Namely, that if it had been the intention of the early followers of Jesus to manufacture a particular understanding of Jesus being alive, why is it there is so much diversity in the reports of the experiences? So first of all, is it possible for a group of people to have similar hallucinations? And secondly, why then, in any case, is there such a diversity in the reports of their experiences?
Well, there's an example cited in the Encyclopedia Britannica, which is the one that comes to my mind most immediately, of lifeboat survivors all being completely convinced that they're seeing a ship on the horizon, and they all think they're seeing the same ship because it's caused by memory contamination. What will happen is someone will say they see something, and then another person will suddenly be inspired by suggestion to see it. And the more they talk about it, the more that they infect each other regarding the details of this hallucination, so that they both become convinced that they have seen the same thing, even though, I mean, if we could jump into their minds, we probably wouldn't be seeing exactly the same thing. And this is similar to a lot of hallucinatory situations, such as in the voodoo cults, where a lot of people are possessed by spirits and so forth and claim to be enjoying the same spirit embodying them, or Pentecostals being possessed by the Holy Spirit. They think it's the same spirit, of course, but it's all telling them different things. So this is the kind of thing I'm talking about. Whether there's a possibility that everyone can actually hallucinate exactly the same thing, I'm not sure. I wouldn't even know how you would test that. And we don't have the kind of information we would need to test that in this particular case, whether what they saw was exactly identically the same, or whether it just was believed to have the same content. Regarding the second point, the diversity, I believe, because the Gospels are the genre of myth, that the different way the stories are constructed is because each author has a different way of developing the parable, and he's creating different messages. For example, Matthew wants to paint Jesus as the new Moses. Mark has the Orphic parallel that he wants to make, and so forth. Luke, of course, has the Sarcicist dogma that he wants to enforce. And because they all have different objectives and different agendas, and of course, because there's no historical tradition for them, or hardly any historical tradition for them to toe the line to, they're all pretty much coming up with different things, and that's why we have different stories.
Well, the Britannica article was from 1962, 42 years ago. And if you didn't like C.S. Lewis, who was writing around the same time, I don't know why you like Britannica.
Yeah, well, it's still, well, it's a difference between science and a theologian. I mean, we're talking about documented science here. It's whether it's 1962 or not, it's still scientific documentation.
Well, a lot have changed in science over the last 42 years.
Well, yes, but if you have a documented case of a mass hallucination in 1962, it's a documented case. It's
well,
scientific.
It's not, because I read that case in Britannica, and it just says they were having hallucinations, but of a ship over there. But I'll tell you what, you know, if that ship got closer and they started looking and they saw that the same hull number was there, then I'd say it's time for them to start yelling out, because it's a real ship. Now, regarding similar hallucinations, I had an opportunity to talk to a number of Navy SEALs. I live in Virginia Beach. We have several of the Navy SEALs stationed there, 4 of the SEAL teams. And they tell me that when they're going through Hell Week, they go through a time where they're not sleeping. They only get 3 to 5 hours of sleep the entire week, not every night, but the entire week. And during that time, most of the SEALs, probably 80% of them, experience hallucinations due to sleep deprivation. So they usually do it at the same place when they're all out in this raft just rowing.
It's actually happened to me, by the way. I've had a hallucination.
You're a Navy SEAL?
No, I've had sleep deprivation hallucination.
Okay. So yeah. So I mean that's pretty
in the
common.
Military, but not the SEALs.
Yeah. Well, it's pretty common to have sleep deprivation hallucinations. The thing is, here all these guys are in the same frame of mind. They're all 80% are hallucinating, but it's interesting when you talk to them, they're not hallucinating the same thing. One guy said he saw an octopus come out of the water and wave at him. Another thought he saw a train coming across the water, and he actually rolled out of the boat because he couldn't convince the rest of the guys who were in the same frame of mind that they saw it. Another guy told me, he was a lieutenant, and he said he distinctly remembered a guy waving his paddle near, and people said, "What are you doing?" And he says, "Well, I'm trying to hit the dolphins that are jumping over the boat." And he said, "Well, did you see the dolphins?" "No." "Did anyone else see the dolphins?" "No, they were having their own hallucinations." So they have these group hallucinations. They're all in the same frame of mind, but they're different hallucinations. Thus, when we have multiple sources attesting to the group hallucinations the group appearances that the disciples were having, these couldn't have been hallucinations, because hallucinations are private occurrences like dreams. But yet the accounts we have said they saw Jesus, they reported what he was saying, and these agree with each other.
Well, I think it's a mistaken reasoning to assume that because a lot of group hallucinations aren't of the same thing, that there are no group hallucinations that are of the same thing. And I think in a situation where there's a cultural circumstance, especially if there's a powerful leader and a particular common shared motivation to hallucinate the same thing, that leader can inspire through memory contamination and suggestion people to think that they're experiencing the same thing, especially if the experience is similar to the Pentecostal one described in Luke.
I'm sorry, but what you're talking about is delusion, not hallucination. And that's entirely different psychological phenomenon.
The point is that they thought that they were experiencing the Spirit of Christ. I mean, that's the point. What our technical term for it is, what they thought was that they were seeing Jesus. That's the point.
Yeah, but so are you saying they're having a hallucination or a delusion?
Well, I'm not going to get into a technical debate over what exact word to use. You can use either word you want. What I'm talking about is it's a natural phenomenon versus... What's that?
They are distinctly different. Besides, whatever the case, neither of them account for the empty tomb, which does have evidence for it. I know you don't agree with it.
I've made my case on that, though.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Okay, a follow-up question then from Mr. Carrier. If Paul was hallucinating, tired, etc., do you think he would risk his life on the basis of that kind of a hallucination? If he did not experience the power of the risen Christ in his life, why would he risk his life and everything that he had worked for up until that time?
Because Paul believed what he was doing was right. You have to understand that in the ancient world, Paul didn't think he was just going mad. He thought that God himself had talked to him. He took that seriously. There's a lot of people who thought God was seriously talking to them, and they've done quite amazing things, right down to submitting themselves to death, because that's what they believed. The issue is what Paul believed. There's a difference between what Paul believed and what we have grounds to believe today. Now, maybe, possibly, God actually did appear to Paul, but we just don't have enough evidence to confirm that, whereas we have lots of evidence. We have no evidence, for example, to confirm, well, no, let's put it this way. There's no scientific confirmation that God has ever actually appeared to anyone, but we have lots of scientific confirmation that hallucinations can convince people that they've experienced God. So with the little amount of evidence we have, and it's not good at all, we're in a situation where we have to decide what is more probable, that Paul encountered something that was natural and that we have scientifically demonstrated is common, or that Paul experienced something that we've never confirmed existed scientifically ever.
Well, the thing is, we have to work out as historians what can best account for why Paul changed his belief from a persecutor of the church to one of its most greatest advocates. And it's not just Paul here that we're looking at. Sure, we can't prove it scientifically. I'm sorry we didn't have video cameras back then. But Paul, it's not only Paul who says he saw it. If it was just Paul, that might be one thing. But it's also the skeptic James. It's also a number of different appearances to the disciples. And as I've argued, we have an empty tomb. Now, regarding the scientific thing, we've seen the frequency probability of hallucinations versus appearances of deity to people. Today we know that you can't get something out of nothing. Scientifically, we know that. Nothing produces nothing. Ex nihilo nihil fit. But yet, the unanimous consensus, I shouldn't say unanimous, but the overwhelming majority of cosmologists today, not cosmetologists, but cosmologists, those who study the cosmos, agree that the universe came out of nothing, ex nihilo. And so the thing is, if we're going to go with the frequency probability argument that you suggest, it seems that the universe doesn't exist, and therefore we're not even talking.
Well, this is a whole different debate. Whether God exists or not is irrelevant. Maybe Muhammad exists. It has nothing to do with whether Jesus was risen from the dead.
Yeah,
I mean,
but I didn't say that
the point is not whether
existence
God
of God
exists.
there.
I never said anything. I never even argued that God doesn't exist. All I argued was that we have no scientific evidence that God appears to people or performs miracles. That's the point. I mean, maybe God does exist and doesn't do those things. Or maybe he does exist and only does them for Muslims. We don't really know. I mean, that's a whole separate debate. But the point is, we've never scientifically confirmed that God appears to people, but we have scientifically confirmed that people believe God has appeared to them through a natural phenomenon. So That's my point. That's the basis that I rested my argument on.
Well, I think
Okay.
it kind of begs the question, though, because what we're looking at here, if you're looking for evidence that God has acted in history, you can't say that we don't have that evidence, because we're looking at that very evidence right now
Well,
regarding
I'm
Jesus'
talking
resurrection.
about scientific confirmation. We
So
have
what-
scientific confirmation of natural hallucination. We do not have scientific confirmation that God has really appeared to people. And when you have to do history, you have to do history based on what is established, what we know and has been established scientifically, based on norms. And that's why I say that the probability of a genuine appearance of God must be extraordinarily low, because we haven't confirmed any of them. So that means that even if they really do exist, they must be really rare, whereas hallucinations are really common. In Bayesian analysis, for example, this is referred to as prior probability, and it affects the outcome of the calculation that any particular claim is true. And that's the reason I brought this up, is that in order to overcome this low prior probability, you need a lot of really good evidence, and we just don't have that.
Problem is when
Okay,
we come to-
gentlemen, it's 5 after 10.
Oh, wow.
I'm willing to give each one of you a minute to say what last you'd like to say to this fine bunch of people who've been listening to you all this time. Who wants to go first?
You want me to take it? Well, for just a minute, all I'd have to say is that we didn't even touch the tip of the iceberg.
All right.
This particular theory that I have defended here today, I argue at great length in a book that's coming out next summer called Jesus is Dead. It's a book that will have chapters by numerous authors, some well-known skeptics in the community. I have 3 chapters in there. One of them is this. It's a very extensive, very well documented, and it answers a lot of questions that were probably raised today but not answered. So keep your eye out for that.
Okay.
I just want to thank you all for your patience in listening to us, and I have enjoyed this exchange. Thank you, Richard. This has
yes,
been
yes.
fun. I've documented this, my position, quite extensively in a new book published by Kriegel that should be in bookstores any day now, called The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. And I co-authored this with Gary Habermas, perhaps the foremost authority in the world on the evidence for the resurrection. And again, it should be in bookstores within any day now. If you would like a copy, though, you're welcome to email me at my website at risenjesus.com, and can hook you up with one.
Please join me then in thanking these gentlemen for an excellent evening.